Back in November 2013, Hopoo Games released a sci-fi action platformer known as Risk of Rain to very positive reviews. You controlled one of several survivors on a hostile alien planet, jumping from area to area through the use of teleporters, defeating vicious alien creatures to acquire gold with which you spend to open boxes. Inside these boxes were a myriad of items with numerous effects that would help you survive. However, you were also on a time budget. The longer you played, the harder the game would get for you. On the game's default difficulty level, you weren't able to leisurely stroll through each area, grinding gold to acquire all the items. It just made the endgame way too hard, especially for certain survivors. The inevitable sequel, Risk of Rain 2, released in August 2020. It's basically the original, but brought to you in glorious 3D modeling instead of the original's 2D sprite work. Not a lot of it is lost in translation, as the items, enemies, and bosses act how you'd expect they would with actual freedom of movement. There's plenty of new areas to wander about in, and lots of new survivors. Familiar faces from the original, like the Huntress, Engineer, and Acrid, join new faces such as the Commando, Captain, and Artificer. Each survivor brings their own unique abilities to the table, ensuring that there's plenty of variety and challenge. Some of the survivors in Risk of Rain 2 have a much easier time than others. For example, the Commando is a very straightforward combatant, very mobile, but his damage output leaves a bit to be desired. Because he doesn't have much in the way of crowd control, getting to later levels while the difficulty is still low is very important for him, and his playstyle is very run and gun. On the other hand, the Artificer is all about dishing out damage, able to melt the game's elite enemies and even bosses in very little time, allowing you more wiggle room compared to the aforementioned Commando. Every survivor has a loadout, which comes with a default kit, but you'll notice that there's a number of other abilities that are locked behind achievements, one of Risk of Rain 2's many progression systems. Some of them are pretty easy, like Acrid needing to poison 1,000 total times. Others are more convoluted and require luck or specific setups, like Huntress needing to hit a killing blow on every possible hit on her multi-hit glaive attack, or collect and carry 12 crowbar items at the same time. I'm a bit torn on how much I like or dislike a lot of these challenges, but they don't seem spectacularly difficult in most cases, just a bit complicated, so I'm willing to at least give it a pass. Each stage layout and goal is the same, requiring you to search for the teleporter, blasting aliens and acquiring items as you go. Even if you quickly find the teleporter, there's still some strategy involved in continuing to traverse the level depending on survivor. It's good to acquire items early on while boxes are cheap to open and shrines are easier to use, because later on, swarms of enemies will make that more of a challenge for you. I find that the sweet spot for most survivors is around 5 to 6 minutes per level. That way, when you reach the later levels, you're still decently equipped and able to handle that higher difficulty. The many items in Risk of Rain 2 help keep things fresh from run to run, and as you unlock achievements, you're also unlocking items, which is where I found a lot of joy. Being rewarded for doing well is the most basic of game development basics, but the developers clearly knew what they were doing here. Unlocked items appear on subsequent runs, making your next session just that little bit easier. It's pretty safe to say that, beyond understanding the game and survivors, knowing what items do what and how they benefit you is key to getting deeper into the game's many levels and being able to handle its highest difficulties. The game's graphics do leave a bit to be desired. While the stages themselves are very atmospheric and generally spectacular, the aesthetics for the enemies aren't great. You don't generally get up and personal with the enemies as you play, but they're all really basic and don't challenge your imagination. To be fair, they're all 3D renditions of enemies from the original game, which themselves were also very simplistic, but nothing was changed to make them look more interesting. As far as the music, the game's soundtrack is actually really good. The synthy sort of tracks you would expect from a sci-fi game all about slaughtering thousands of creatures while stranded alone on an alien planet. While I did enjoy the music, I still found myself eventually turning it off to listen to my own tunes about 6 or 7 hours in, but that's more due to my own personal preferences than it is a failing of the game's soundtrack. As for the sound effects, they're fitting, but nothing to write home about. They do what they were made to do, but they consistently fail to exceed anything beyond just okay. One of the game's biggest problems is its lack of diversity in the enemies you fight, which is a big deal because you'll be spending hours smashing them. Because most of the enemies are derived from the original game, it seems that they didn't really go out of their way to add more, which is unfortunate because adding more variety would have gone a long way to making a game with high replay value have even greater replay value. I got about 20 hours into the game and destroying the same fireballs, jellyfish, lizard men, and sentient statues started to get a little dull. All of the game's variety, once the honeymoon period with the game's aesthetics and enemies wore off, came from the survivors and how they individually handled enemies and levels. This is also a big problem with the bosses. There's only a handful of bosses that spawn during teleporter events, and while the first several times you fight them are a fun challenge, you quickly learn how to cheese them or just handle them in general, and then they become a speed bump you have no choice but to hit at the end of every level, which is a bad look for a game that is, again, supposed to be all about killing enemies. Even some of the game's special bosses seem to be recolors of normal bosses, which is unfortunate but unavoidable, I guess. Another issue, while not huge, is understanding the game's many items. Knowing what items do what boils down to acquiring them and memorizing that for further runs, but would it have killed them to let me see each item's description when the game offers me specific item choices? Each stage has several of these little item holders that let you choose from what's on offer, along with 3D printers, where you can trade items to get specific items. A huge quality of life update would be to let players see what each item does in these instances, so choosing what's best for your survivor is easier early on when you're still working to understand the game. The game does have an online cooperative mode, but after the initial rush of people buying and playing it because all the popular Twitch streamers were playing it, the servers are all essentially dead and there's very few people playing it online. This isn't exactly a problem with the game per se, but just the natural lifespan of a game like this. It's unfortunate to see, but also something worth mentioning, since if you're here watching this review, you're probably considering buying it and want to make an informed decision. Just know that if you want to play online, you're going to have to find friends to play with you, because playing with randoms can be a bit of a challenge, especially if you're picky. Beyond those things, it took me about 20 hours of gameplay to realize that I wasn't having fun because the game quickly became a slog. As the endorphin rush of unlocking survivors, items, and abilities began to slow, the game's most glaring flaw began to show itself. For a roguelike, a game that's supposed to be all about variety, there's a disturbingly finite amount of enjoyment you can get out of it. I could probably get an extra 5 or 10 hours if I were to play online with friends, but a 30-hour roguelike is extraordinarily low, not especially since I was able to get 200 hours out of Binding of Isaac Rebirth before falling off of it. Hell, I even put 50 hours into the original Risk of Rain. For Risk of Rain 2, however, I'm at the point where I'm struggling to find reasons to continue to play beyond getting footage for this review. Why is this a problem for Risk of Rain 2 and not its originator? My hypothesis brings us back around to the start of the review. Risk of Rain 2 is, for the most part, Risk of Rain 1 brought to life in 3D. Because there's not a ton of substantial changes, just more of the same, the sequel suffers because of it. Don't get me wrong, more of the same works well for a lot of things, but here it sadly just falls flat on its face. So, to summarize, Risk of Rain 2 is a good game and certainly worth your time, especially if you've played the original and liked it, but its lack of diversity and its laser-like focus on more of the same from the original title bogs the experience down. If you haven't played the original, you may get more mileage out of the game because every single thing will be brand new to you, but if you're a serious veteran, don't be surprised if you drop off the sequel faster than you anticipated. As of the time of this review, Risk of Rain 2 is normally $25, but often gets as low as $16 during Steam sales. Considering what's here, $25 is a pretty fair price, but $16 is a bargain and definitely worth your consideration if this game is on your wish list. Thanks for hanging out with me today. If you want more Chunky Beef, definitely check out our social media. Links are in the description below. See you next time.